I was extremely insecure the first decade at Bell Labs because I had a very high expectation of myself. I was never happy. I wanted to do better. I saw the bright people around me and I said, I'm never going to get to that level. You don't get the top science by doing it top down. You want to put resources, hire people, but the main question, the new direction comes bottom up and usually from the people that are not yet established, from the young people. That is a fact. The revolutionary stuff comes from areas that people never thought about, or from technology they would say never, it will never work. It will never work. And then it works.
Join the 632 Nanometer podcast team for a live conversation with Federico Capasso, Harvard professor, inventor of the quantum Cascade laser, and pioneer in optical metasurfaces. Federico details his professional career path, his work at Bell Labs, the invention of a quantum Cascade laser, now the most widely used source of infrared radiation, and advice on how to succeed in the art of science.
Federico, you've had a very successful and illustrious career spanning industry, academia, and more recently the startup space. Tell us a little bit about the early days of your physics journey.
Well, thank you, first of all, for inviting me for this freewheeling discussion. And I like the idea that it's freewheeling, open to any kind of questions, which is related, of course, to science and physics. So I started very simple. I remember when I was 70, first of all, I never thought I had a particular talent for physics and science when I was a kid. And in fact, I struggled in math and mightily the first year. And one day, my dad gave me a book by a famous science writer then, and the title of this book was "My Friend the Atom." And I simply fell in love with the subject, told the story of the major discoveries in nuclear physics, in particular the atom. And it was love at first sight. And I never wavered. I decided when I was 7 years old, I want to become a physicist, and I persisted. And it wasn't easy because I quickly realized, as a high school student, I was okay, but I didn't have that kind of talent to solve problems. And then when I got into physics, physics in Rome was always very hard. It was a fantastic place. It's still now, got the Nobel Prize with Giorgio Parisi. And the standards were very high, but students were basically left to themselves. That was the old European style. You study very hard, you do your exams. If you pass them, file. Most of the exams, some of the exams, the first 2 years, 80% of the students would fail them. Then you would repeat them. So after 2 years, I was very discouraged. And I said, I'll never become a good physicist. It's so hard. I just can't take it anymore. I wanted to abandon the physics faculty. Fortunately, my stubborn mom, that Italian moms are often as stubborn as Jewish moms. And she said, you will continue. So then suddenly over a year, I started to get the gist of things. And I realized, well, maybe I have some talents. Then I did my doctorate. That was very hard because my advisor was a very tough cookie, although extremely talented. He had studied, worked with Charlie Towns, done major work in quantum electronics, was a hard master. And in the middle of the thesis, I said, that's it. Now this is the time to leave physics. I'm no good at it. The experiments don't work. Then eventually the experiments worked out magically. And then it's only then, 26 years old, 25, that I started to gain some confidence in my talent, honestly. Now, he offered me to say, why don't you want to stay with me after? And I said, I didn't tell him, no way. Also, I don't want to be paid nothing. In the old days, they say that in Italy, the style was this. You work for free, literally for 2 years. Now it has changed. And then your professor probably can succeed to give you a fellowship. I said, no way. So I decided to become a high school teacher So I taught in a technical institute for 9 months to a year. I liked teaching. I lost my voice after 2 classes, so it was a struggle to regain my voice. After that, I got a job offer to work at an institute, which then was very top. It was the so-called, in those days, every so-called post office in Europe would have a research laboratory. So it was the Italian post office. Even though the Italian mail is not famous for its efficiency, still the research lab was great. So I learned quite a bit. I was doing optical fibers, and then the break came. I participated in 3 fellowships for international to go abroad. I won the 3 of them. Now, the interesting side, I have to admit, I was on 2 of them the only competitor, and on the other one, there were 2. And because in the old days, I would say most young people in physics in Italy would find job easily. They wouldn't want to go abroad, maybe at CERN to do high energy physics. So I won 2 of them, and then I decided to go. They wanted to send me. I got a Rotary Fellowship. They want to send me to Ireland in Belfast. That was under the bombs, terrorism. I said, I'm sorry, I just got married. I don't want to go there. So my boss contacted Bell Labs, and they said, and they would. So I went with this fellowship. So it was good. That's how my career started. And so I wouldn't say I was lucky. Also, the main ingredient, I think, I always had a tremendous passion for physics, for science. I don't hesitate in calling it a love affair, and that continues to actually guide me. So that's sort of my beginnings.
Yeah, Paula would not like that. Paula is his wife. So let's say that physics is your second biggest love affair.
Yeah, but let me tell you something. It's interesting you make that comment, because my wife is the daughter of a very famous physicist, Giorgio Salvini, who worked with Rubbia, many achievements in high energy physics, and he had vowed, I would never marry a physicist in my life. That changed when she actually met him, which is very good for me.
Amazing. So, were you mostly working on theory when you were still doing your PhD, or already heavily involved in?
This is a very good question. I wanted to start to become a theory. I mean, a theory in Rome was always a powerhouse. The very famous people like Nicola Cabibbo, who incidentally should have won his own Nobel Prize, Iona Lasinio. I mean, a lot of giants in theory. And I wanted to become, and then it happened to be that a guy by the name of Giorgio Parisi was 1 year ahead of me. And it was so obvious that his theoretical talents were so exceptional. He was publishing papers before his PhD that I said, look, I am an ambitious person. There's no way I could even get close to his theoretical skill. So I better become an experimentist. In fact, once I told Giorgio, I said, Giorgio, you are one of the reasons that I decided to go become an experimentalist, which did well for me, because then I went to Bell Labs, and that's where really my career started.
But you were truly comparing to the absolute best. He just got the Nobel Prize. So.
Well, but it wasn't obvious then. There was so many brilliant young theorists, and another one which is pretty prominent is Luciano Pietronero, who has done major contribution. So I saw just the level of these young people, and I said, it doesn't matter whether we will win another Nobel Prize. I'm just, and the fact I realized early on, see, in the early days, you could go quite far in theory with, I would say, linear algebra, calculus, and computers were not particularly into it. But over the years, the mathematical techniques, the sophistication has become such, okay, that it's we are all doing theory for sure. I published a lot of theory papers, also some Bell Labs, but to get to really the heavy duty theory that often is necessary to make a big breakthrough, I'm glad I realized it early rather than later.
Yeah, so when you arrived at Bell Labs, what were other people working on? Like, what was hot at that time?
Well, you see, at that time is a very good question. I was doing telecom research, I was doing fiber optics and so forth. So my manager at this institute called Fondazione Bordoni, that I still there, decided, why don't you go and learn about semiconductor lasers, And that was the days where it became clear a few years before that optical fibers would become the main way of communication. Okay, this was after a few years after Corning had achieved a big breakthrough of minimizing losses and so forth. So then it's a question about sources. Why don't you go learn about semiconductor lasers? Okay. Now, when I arrived there, Bellas was at the top in that area, and I said, "Look, I want to stay in this place. I'm not going to do what my manager tells me to do. I'm going to work on something else." And unilaterally, I decided, without telling my boss, I'm going to work on avalanche photodiodes. There was no one working on it. I liked the physics. And so I had my very first good ideas in that area. After a year, when my boss's boss heard, when I asked, can I stay for an extra year on leave? They got mad at me. They said, Federico, you have to resign on the spot. I had a permanent job because you really haven't been doing what you were supposed to do. So I said, bye bye, fine. This is my ticket. So that's how my, and then, from avalanche photodiodes, that was the era where molecular beam epitaxy was starting to make these atomically thin layers. And then what happened? I started to see the connection between these ultra thin layers and ability to make very low noise avalanche photodiode. And then what happened after 2 years, Bell Labs offered me a regular position. That was a fantastic thing. And then after, it was a hard place to work, Bell Labs. I mean, the standards were very high. You were often compared to the world's best. It wasn't easy, but they would give you resources. And more importantly, you had access to fantastic discussion, fantastic colleagues. You were working at the frontier of science and technology. That's the greatest thing.
Federica, could you maybe talk a little bit more on that times when there was, I think, a race in the semiconductor lasers development? So especially we know that there is a Nobel Prize which was given to Jarez Alferov, and I know in Bell Labs there was almost like head to head. They would do the similar type of developments.
Yeah.
So what was the atmosphere? Did you start working at Bell Labs at that times when it was during the race, or it was already different time?
The race has already, in fact, started and going on. And yes, I would say the two competitors of Alfirov and other people were, in fact, Hayashi and Panish. And I don't want to make any comments. Certainly, they would have been as deserving, probably, to win the Nobel Prize. They had phenomenal type of devices. They had very convincing evidence of continuous wave at room temperature. It was a close race. I mean, and that was the heyday of heterostructures, where it became all of a sudden, a lot of work. Right, first with liquid phase epitaxy, then with other techniques by vapor phase, that heterostructure would make a big impact on devices like semiconductor lasers. And then it was that time that I realized, is after talking to the crystal goer like Al Shaw, I remember vividly, I saw there are enormous possibility of engineering new devices. And that's how I call this area bang gap engineering or band structure. And then I had a lot of fun for many years. And then eventually the peak of this work area I worked in became the quantum cascade laser. But that, was 20 years after the heterostructure, the actual diode laser.
So this is interesting. It seems like your interest in quantum cascade lasers or working in this field was also guided by the technological development of molecular beam epitaxies.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing that I think is part of my style. I'm happy with it. I can also say maybe that I'm proud of it. And I sort of, Bell Labs is my second alma mater. University of Rome gave me very good education, very basic, maybe a bit too encyclopedic, but it was good because we studied everything, from general relativity, to very broad type. That was the foundation. At Bell Labs, I understood the power of combining technology with science and be driven not by fields, not by field, but by problem solving. So when you're solving a problem, who cares whether you call this basic and applied? I cannot stand the distinction. This is basic and applied work. This is simply nonsense. I mean, fundamental discoveries are rooted in technology from the Big Bang, so many other things. So that always, yes, I was interested. I developed a taste to working at the interface between, you can call it basic or applied research or better technology, and they feed into each other. And it's going to happen more and more and more. So it's too bad when people continue to do this division saying that fundamental science leads to technology. That's only one path. Then there is the opposite path that technology feeds into science, leading to generation of new science. So it's a feedback. So it's very sad, this continuous nonsensical, frankly stupid distinction about basic and applied work. I mean, you can distinguish research from development. That is definitely true. But don't make these other distinctions. They're not helping, and they're not helping young people choosing their own fields, by the way.
Yes, absolutely. And I remember you saying, actually, the very first time I met you, that one of the things that illustrates this principle was the invention of the lens, because then you could actually observe celestial objects. So, yeah, that's an extremely good point. I think Misha has another question about QCLs.
Right. So, Professor Capasso, since you're very famous for the construction of the development of the quantum cascade laser, could you explain simply for the audience maybe the physical principles, how it works, and what was the major novelty for this new light source?
Yeah, I mean that is in fact that the reason I started this really I'm going to explain it exactly how the picture came to my mind. Okay, I was working on a different type of device. That was my really first good invention called staircase avalanche photodiode. And I conceived that in 1984. I wrote a theoretical paper because it was very difficult to find the material. But essentially, what you can do is construct a material where the energy band gap varies with distance like the back of a dinosaur, literally, like a sawtooth. Okay? So that's what I had in mind. So you have the linear potential, and then you have a drop, and again up and down. So you have a sawtooth. And then I said, if I can apply a bias now, I can apply the bias such that the sections that are tilted, they become flat, and that the sawtooth turns into a staircase. So that was the first step. Then I had an idea. I said, I want to use these energy steps of sufficiently high energy. So as an electron goes over the actual step, it gains sufficient kinetic energy given by the size of the step that it can create an electron hole pair by impact ionization after the actual step. So that's like the dynamo of a photomultiplier. So I did the theory, and I showed that this device would have a lower noise than any other avalanche photodiode. And then what happened is I knew it was so hard to do. Now I'll go to the quantum cascade laser. This device was made finally last year. I was so happy. 40 years after the invention and my theory paper, a group in the United States made this device, and it worked exactly as predicted. So I was very proud, I must say. You see, sometimes it takes up to 40 years. Now, that gave me the first idea for the quantum cascade laser, because then I said, now, how can I make a step such that instead of going downhill and creating an electron hole pair by impact ionization, I create a photon? Then that's interesting. Now, at every step I can create a photon, maybe I can make a laser. The next step was not easy at all, and the critical step was actually for me to hire a phenomenal postdoc, Jerome Feist, who is a professor at the ETH in Zurich. And then we worked very hard together for 3 years to try to different designs and so forth. And at some point, nothing seems to work. There were only 2 months left. And then I said, I don't even know. I'm going to tell my boss, to renew him for another year. There's zero result. And then bingo, the breakthrough came. I remember I was at the Metropolitan Opera listening to an opera. And here he calls me Jerome, says, Federico, it lasers. Then we had the field to ourselves for 5 years. And then it took off, a lot of collaboration and so forth. So that's how the story went, basically.
I see. And as I understand, that main paper is the results, the first results were published in Science in 1994.
Yeah.
And then I also looked in that work you mentioned that the first proposal of the quantum cascade was mentioned earlier.
Yeah, Kazarinov and Suris. Now,
right.
that was very clever. I mean, Kazarinov proposed in 1970 the idea to use a superlattice to apply an electric field. The key points are to use resonant tunneling to pump the excited states, and the second, of course, was to use transition between the electronic states. So there is no band gap that you use. Okay, this is an emission between the electrons that jump between quantized state in the conduction band. That all was in Casarinov's paper, but there was but there was a missing point, and I can't fault them. I tried to make the device; it didn't work, and it's a bit maybe too technical to explain now. Why it didn't work. So we had to invent a very important thing that we had to create a certain phonon resonance, okay, and other stuff. And then once we added this essential element, it lased.
See, wow, so very interesting. So it seems like it was not just pure implementation of that idea, but it seems like the idea was missing that critical part, right?
Not at all. I tried 1 year with another postdoc to really do the Casarino-Suris proposal. It just didn't work. There was a missing element. This is typical in science. There was still a pioneering paper. I mean, it was written in the early 70s. Our device was realized and redesigned in more than 20 years later, right?
And just curious, you said before, the quantum cascade laser, every time I hear it's about the conduction band, and there you see those electrons going from one side to the other side through the superlattice. So I'm curious, what about the valence band? Is it possible to do it with the holes as well, to move them instead of electrons?
Yeah, Jerome Feist has tried for years, but it doesn't quite work. One thing is that the holes have a larger tunneling mass, so you have to try to use strain to do an hybridization of strain and reduce the mass. And no one has succeeded. They made a light emitting device out of it, but that's it.
Okay, so it's quite challenging. Yeah.
And also interesting, so it would be really interesting to hear what were the other big challenges at that time to build a quantum cascade laser, or was it just the right time that all of the technological...
I worked with my main collaborators at Bell Labs was Al Shaw, very famous scientist. I would fair to say he is the main contributor of creating molecular beam epitaxy. I remember when I started talking to him, I did a lot of work before the quantum cascade laser. The quantum cascade laser was the actual peak, but I worked on high-speed transistor. I worked on all kinds of devices, photodiodes. I worked on resonant tunneling devices for many years. I made a name for myself in this field. Then I had always in the back of my mind the laser. And at some point, I felt once we worked on a particular heterostructure material, I realized that was, and through the work on tunneling, I realized this is a time to really go and try to make a laser. So it was also good timing. And after, I'd worked for more than 94, almost 13 years, 12 years already on this engineered heterostructure. And other groups had tried, but they didn't have the right ideas. In fact, at some point, a prominent person, I won't mention the name, because a very good scientist had written a paper saying that fundamentally this type of laser cannot work. And but that was a wrong argument.
Yeah, that's impressive. It's like looking through the paper and seeing the structure of, what was it, about 500 layers of
Yeah, yeah,
35 materials, and
yeah.
it's unbelievable.
But after a while, I got tired of quantum cascade laser. I mean, one of my messages is always, it's not only to myself, but in particular to the young people, and this: rejuvenate yourself. You, at some point, it's so tempting. You are successful in an area, you might become the top one or two. That's the time to start thinking about doing something else. Otherwise, your mind becomes sclerotic. It could become sclerotic even if you're a young person. There are people that, there is a beautiful expression in English and in American: to beat a dead horse to death. I think that's not good for one's, for me, for you, for whoever, and it's not a good advice. I think at some point one has to move on, look for new challenges, and that's what I'm still doing now. Now flat optics is going to become a very big thing. It's going to be in cell phones in an actual few years for sure. I'm already thinking, what's the next big wave? And of course, it's not easy, right? Other research is not easy. The most difficult thing is in research is to everyone can learn excellent skills. The important thing is to find the good question, the good problems, and that's the hard part, right? And as I'm always seeking for new things.
Hi, Federico. Just a question. What are all the things that go wrong with molecular beam epitaxy? I imagine you had to really struggle with the tool since you were playing with the first one.
I wasn't doing any of that. That was all Al Shaw. Al Shaw was a musician of molecular beam epitaxy. In the early stages, he was growing layers sort of without even having a computer controlling the actual shutters, and he used to quit. A kid me then says, Federico, my hands are better than a computer. Then he eventually got converted to use a computer to control the shutters, because once we were asking, down to a few monolayers, right? But it was a lot of very systematic work that he did, combined with some good science. Like he had the idea to use read, basically this electron diffraction that would tell him that you grow crystalline things. But it was very interesting for him. With him, working with him, I learned, a lot of people then and even now are spending a lot of time to characterize the material, and then they make the device after. I simply skip the material characterization. We characterize the material by trying to make a good device. And the device itself was much more telling in terms of the quality of the material than maybe measuring photoluminescence of stuff that is important for something else, but not for that device. So I learned how to take a good shortcuts, to use the device results fed back. We would get a wafer from our show, and within days it was fabricated. Within 2 days, we were working day and night then. The parking lot of Bell Labs was always full, day and night, and so we get quick feedback. So once we hit on the jackpot, we would lead the field for a number of years.
Mm-hmm. And also, like you speaking here about leading and everything else as well, and going on ambition and following that. How was it like when you were as a manager? Because you also became, eventually in your career, you became a manager in Bell Labs and everything.
Well, you see, Bellas, this is a very good question. Bellas was a fantastic place. First of all, the management, I always had excellent managers. You could not be promoted to department head unless you had done some first-rate science. That was the most important thing. And managers were required, department heads, to continue their research. So it was not an easy job, and not just, continue. It's almost you had two full-time jobs. You were a department head, and so I managed to organize myself. I started to hire 2 or 3 postdocs. I had some external funding. It wasn't easy. I mean, there was a push for excellence at the highest level. And every year, every researcher got evaluated in a process called performance review that would last 2 weeks. And it was very effective. Every manager would have to present the research of all their people. So at some point, I had 20 people. I had to present the actual case for 20 people. And I was studying like a student because my colleagues, who were expert often, could give me actually hard time saying, "Is this really true, Federico?" So it was a nightmare, but it was a good process. And at the end, people were evaluated every year, but they were given a window of time of about 3 to 5 years to show the first important results. If nothing came after a period of 3 to 5 years, pressure would start to mount, and eventually, unless people had a breakthrough, were kindly asked and often helped to find a good job. Right, but there was patience because if one had a big success, then there was obviously say, we have to give a longer leash to this person, So I felt, did I feel under pressure? Absolutely. It was more competitive pressure by very bright colleagues. And also, you wanted to do the best. But no one ever told me, Federico, you should have this result by this time. I never asked my people that. It was self induced.
And what was exactly included in that performance matrix you said? Like you had a 20 performance report of
No, you had to literally speak. You had to literally present the case around the table. You could show not slides, but picture data. And we were never counting papers, which is very good. Never once. I remember when an important results on the fractional quantum Hall effect came out from my group. I presented the raw data like this as a case. That was the famous 5.5 states of the fractional quantum Hall effect that is still not completely understood. Bob Willett, in fact, he won a big prize for it. I presented the raw data there, and everyone liked it. I could say, this is what it is. That's it. He actually got credit even without the paper published, So there was de-emphasizing the number of papers. Of course, you better publish, otherwise, you need to have a record, right?
Federico, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the day-to-day at Bell Labs. So we read some stories about there being like a mathematician table, a physicist table. What was it like? How many impressive people did you get to interact with on a regular basis? And
well, I mean, the lunches at Bell Labs were legendary because we would gather informally in tables, and then discussion started. And people would brainstorm and scribble on napkins. And I saw in real time new ideas coming out at the lunchtime. It was a very interesting culture. There was competition to be the best and so forth, but there was also a lot of collaboration. I've rarely seen never before such an environment to be so open, collaborative, argumentative, at the same time a competitive and collaborative. So it was that's how I learned. Well, I think we know the style of our group meetings are very interactive, and I realized then that brainstorming, open discussion are an essential ingredient in science, and it needs to be encouraged. And sometimes it's not easy.
Is there any napkin idea in particular you can think of that turned into something very fruitful or big?
In my research, I have to think about it. Yeah, there was. It will probably come back. You have triggered my neurons. Hopefully, it will actually come back. Okay, but I remember, for example, the early discussions about the quantum computational algorithm. Peter Shor there was at Bell Labs, and that has become one of the famous quantum algorithm. But then there was the search algorithm of Grover. And I remember, in fact, that came out because this very smart fellow, Grover, said, well, I need to invent, something as good and as smart as what Peter Shor did. So again, it was this good competitive pressure to try to do your best. Now, specific things, I know once Horst Stormer told me he won the Nobel Prize for the fractional quantum effect. It happened to him that some key ideas came to him at lunchtime. It more than the timing is the fact that this provided food for thought, discussion with high level people. I mean, at the time before the big cuts, I mean, you could find that. I mean, Bellas was doing top research in astrophysics. For example, the first key experiment on gravitational lensing were done by Tony Tyson, a world-class astrophysicist. Okay, there were just about any field of physics. There were even people working on neutrino physics, notwithstanding the fact that work of Penzias and Williams led to a new area of research in astrophysics, right? Submillimeter wave astronomy and so forth, right? And then you had condensed matter. I mean, what I think came out of Bell Labs integrated over a period of 50 years, even if you forget the Nobel Prize, is unparalleled in terms of impact on science and technology by a single institution. I think the way it was set up was very smart. There was a lot of freedom in research, but there was also focus at the same time. Focus, freedom, funding, the three F's, and accountability. At the end, you were held accountable for your research. You had to show. So this combination and top management. So this, if you like, is the source, the secret. Not really secret, right? I think every institution could do it, but you need to have talented people who also are willing to take a stand.
Do you think that
it's like replicable to this environment of Bell Labs again to start something again similar like that, or is it maybe happening somewhere? Or
yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's a good question has been asked. I think it's it started in the golden era of the industrial laboratories where AT&T was a monopoly. It was called Western Electric before, was a monopoly. So it decided to fund research. But then again, you need to see that the transistor came out because a famous manager, Mervyn Kelly, saw the future. He said, the technology for switching, the mechanical switches, you had women typically put these pins there to create communication. He said, we need a new type of switch. Now, that was not the main application of the transistor. And they said, vacuum tubes are probably not good for that. So we need an effort in solid state physics. So they created a solid state physics group with which happened to have as head Bill Shockley, and then members were Bardeen and Bratton, and in a few years they invented the transistor. So there was a vision behind it, even a management vision. Most of the time, no, it came bottom up by smart people that were let loose, but not completely loose. There was still accountability, and at the end, there was the expectation that even if you are doing long-term science, you would pay attention to technology impact. That was always there.
If you were starting a research institution today like Bell Labs, what would the focus be? Like, what would the directions be that you would focus it on?
I would not. That's, you see, that's the thing that it's so wrong about thing. Years ago, I was offered in a, I won't say the institution, to become head of a big German new institute, and they said, "You are the boss. You come here, you decide the direction, and you hire people." And I said, that will never work. And I told them why. That's a top down approach. You don't get the top science by doing it top down. You want to put resources, hire people, but the main question, the new direction comes, bottom up, and usually from the people that are not yet established, from the young people. That is a fact. I mean, some of the older people of my age might not like to hear it. I've always said it. I have no problem in saying it. Okay, it's the bottom up the way to do it. Let people loose, okay, and accountable. And to create other such institutes, yeah, there is Janelia Farms that was started in fact uses and it's they're doing a lot of optics for biomed interface with near Washington. That's where Eric Betzig did a lot of his pioneering work. Then he moved to Berkeley. Was in a sense, is a sense organized. I think that defining is important, but the way to do it, as I've seen, for example, I will tell you, I have been for years. In fact, I've had a collaboration at the Max Planck Institute in Garching, okay, because I've been a Humboldt Fellow for 6 years. So now, admittedly, the Max Planck is is a great institution. They win Nobel Prize. They do top research. I still have to be a bit critical about certain things because it's very much organized top down. Basically, her professor director is really the master there and basically gives directions. And I've been there for several months. Again, they have top young people. The group leader often is a great top scientist, so it is productive. But I do not think it is the most creative type of environment to generate really groundbreaking science across different interfaces. Because in fact, I know that some of the young people I was talking to them, I said, but why don't you go and talk to that person that is in the other group? He or she can help you. And they said, yeah, but this is in a different group. So what? I said, so what? Just go and talk to them. You don't have to ask your boss. It's a cultural thing. It's not that the head director says you cannot talk to other people. It is the culture that is too a bit top down. Even though I take my hat off, the Max Planck is a great organization, but in my opinion, they could do even more. I mean, and I think overall, if I have to choose between the two, I will choose definitely the bottom up. It's more difficult to organize where you let people loose. It's not that they can do really anything. Like, if a student starts to work on something, they better continue, get some stuff, but you need to do this with that in a very tactful way, right? Not saying you come in. I mean, I've seen advertises, some institution advertise student position to work on a certain topic. I personally think that is wrong. Okay. I never, when I get student advertised, I want a student to work in this. That squelches creativity. Well, they start to play and then they find their way. The same is postdocs. I don't say occasionally, rarely, yes, sometimes, but you know what I'm trying to say. And so, and because to relinquish control is not easy. The boss is in them, like in general, to have control. And too much control is bad. Some control you need to have because you're the group leader, right?
So you say it's very important to encourage people and to really, for example, before you said the freedom, focus, and the lost.
You do it by example. I mean, it works. I think in my groups, it works well. You can always do better. I always think, how can I do things better? So, and the way to do this is, to first of all, to have a very good group meetings. Our group meetings are a key part where people, and to encourage a culture of openness, and you do it yourself. You start, look, the leader sets the tone. That is the general rule. If we have a bad president, the country suffers, and you know what I'm talking about, both in US and in other countries. Okay, the leader sets the tone by his her example that they give every day, and it's not easy. And so, give me a culture of trust and openness when people can discuss things, compare their ideas. That is an essential thing. And you do it sort of day by day. I don't have really a recipe. Took me, I best, after 10 years at Harvard, I said, now I start to have group meetings that I start to actually like. Now we are in a very good point. I still think that we can do better. You know what I mean? And then what you get, the effect, there is kind of a distributed creativity. People realize that they get ideas because they interact with other people that are very good people. And then the group grows and the productivity is increased. You see what I mean?
I think we have a question from the audience from Mikhail Katz.
Hi,
just joined
Mikhail.
us as a speaker.
Yeah, he was a former student of mine, Professor Katz.
I have a question for you. So, what is something that you got wrong over your research career? So, what I mean by that is a trend that you dismissed that turned out to be important, or vice versa, something where, you really changed your mind, or, in retrospect, you see that you had the wrong idea.
Yeah, I mean, well, I remember very well at Bell Labs at some point I had the idea of the quantum confined Stark effect, but I thought that was a triumph for David Miller and Daniel Schemler, and I dismissed it. I said, okay, I can tune the absorption with an electric field, so it's not a big deal compared to the Franz Geldish. What I didn't see the connection to a modulator, to a device, you see, from the very beginning, Dave Miller had the connection to the technology. So was that a miss? Yes, I regretted it because I thought that I could have done it maybe before then. But, I dismissed it because I didn't see the connection to the actual technology. That turned out to be quite a big deal, the quantum confined Stark effect modulator, right?
Yeah, that actually brings up kind of a related point or a related question, which is, sometimes you do research. And if you didn't do it, like if you decided to do something else or you missed it or, you got hit by a bus or something, somebody else would have done it, right around the same time as you, right? You're kind of all racing for the same thing. And so, whereas other times you're doing research and sometimes you come up with something that, is either ahead of its time or it's off to the side or something like that. So what do you think about, I guess, research in fields where that are hot, that are active, that somebody else will probably do the thing if you don't do it? Do you try to get around it, or what's your thing?
This is music to my ears. I even said in my group, I'm not interested in doing the next obvious thing unless it's really. Sometimes it could be it's very important. Then the competitive spirit that I still have takes over, and I would say, let's do it. But in general, one should try to look through more, not in continuing. And so this is the problem of working in crowded fields. In fact, metasurfaces is becoming crowded. Wasn't crowded, as you know, when you, me, and others started it in my group, because it's fair to say our group was one of the very first one to understand the potential of that, right? In fact, there was a famous quote by Graham Bell at the entrance of Bell Labs say, that occasionally go off the beaten the beaten path, and you will be almost sure to find new things. It's actually beautiful quote. So I always think that in particular, for when people have the mental agility of young people, I mean, it is a balance, of course. You need to build the career papers and so forth. But often I see, for example, I interview people. In fact, we have searches going on. And what I don't like, frankly, is okay, you do your PhD in an area. Then I always say, do your postdoc in a different area. Why? You learn. Learning should be the main driving force for researchers, right? It should be the desire, the urge to learn, ideally, a new thing every day. You need to have this passion, right? And then, so I tell them, okay, do your postdoc. But then, once you finish doing your postdoc, if you go for a new job, try to do, if you have learned how to do research, change areas. I see too often people do a thesis, then they do a postdoc in the same area, and then after that they continue to do research. That doesn't help creativity, right? Is it easy? No, it isn't easy. I'm now trying to define some in my mind the next thing. So what I'm doing is I read a lot, and I'm struggling. I'm confident that something hot will come. I don't know exactly when and how and what. So I think, going to your question, it is generally not good to just do adiabatically the next obvious thing, that maybe get even a Nature and a Science. It's much better to go. In fact, there was recently a paper that I tweeted, and in fact, it was widely seen, my tweet, and it's about a proceedings of a National Academy of Science, where they looked at, literally, was a major computer study, something like a billion papers, enormous, in different fields, and they found in generally the crowded fields, to a perverse thing of citations, okay, that people tend to cite these papers and so forth. At the end, it ossifies the innovation. There is this paper that is worth reading. So, in general, the best thing is, particularly I would say, for young people at the beginning of a career, do not choose necessarily a crowded field. Yes, you can get more easily paper published. Are you going to make a name for yourself more easily in a crowded field than in a non-crowded field? Absolutely not. I can prove it. All the work that I did in the most important at Bell Labs and here is that initially in the field they were practically not so many people. When we started to work on QCL, which was a new area, there was just two other groups that I knew that had failed, and it was very difficult. When we started on flat optics, same thing. There were not too many. When I did research on the Casimir effect, there were worldwide probably 5 or 6 experimental group, maybe 3 working on the Casimir effect. Why? The effect was small and they were very difficult. So you can ask, why did I choose the Casimir? Because I saw a connection that I could measure the Casimir force with microelectromechanical system. We wrote a nice paper. And then I ran across an old Russian paper of 60 years about where they predicted famous guy, Lifshitz, Bialochinsky, and another famous Russian, Pitaevsky, the repulsive Casimir force. I said, that's it. Now what I need to get is a bright graduate student. It took him 6 years. He's made a name for himself, Jeremy Monday, with that experiment. And you see, so I think going after non-crowded areas, it's always important.
So one question we had before from the audience was about, so you were talking about Metalenses and everything. So how do you see this field actually expanding? What is the next big thing you see happening there in the future, actually?
Look, in the Metalens, the big thing in technology is these are going to go into cell phones, not in 10 years, within a few years. That's a big thing. You can look at the website of my startup that is not a startup called Metalenses.com. There is a compelling, it is the convergence. The same foundries that make chips will make metalenses. It's starting to happen now. There is a major foundry that unfortunately I cannot, I'm a board member, mention that already has demonstrated 10,000 metalenses on a 12-inch wafer, which is a standard size. That is going to be a big thing. I think that will revolutionize the way of doing optics. It will not replace all of refractive optics, right? The other big area is polarization optics there, right? Polarization, I always say it's in a primitive stage, it's birefringence, birefringent crystal. 2 years ago, we demonstrated polarization sensitive camera with just one metasurface and a lens and a sensor can do what a much more complex polarization camera. And I think polarization will have a major impact. It can allow you to see detail and so forth. So that is going to be a next big thing in actually flat optics. Flat optics will not replace the optics for microscopes. I think that's whoever is saying that they don't know what they're talking about now. That is too entrenched technology. Microscopes work extremely well. There are medical applications that could be very interesting and so forth, right? So, and then there's always well, I can tell you, structure dark. We published a paper early this year. This is the brainchild of one of my brilliant students, Daniel Lim, where what we demonstrated is how to create two-dimensional singular region, sheets of dark. Now, why do you care about creating a sheet of dark, not just a line like in a vortex? Well, because you can use them. Maybe see the dark doesn't have the diffraction limit, right? That was shown, in fact, by the work of Stefan Hell on the STED microscopy, that in fact uses the singularity at the center of an optical vortex. But by making a different type of singularities, one can do, for example, we are trying, yes, my vision is to use a structure dark to look at maybe point defects in transparent materials, right? The other idea is to use this new kind of polarization optics to do stress tomography in materials. So I see potentially a lot of impact in different areas of science and technology.
Federico, well, I just have a general question. You've throughout your career obviously been yourself involved and supported a lot of people through, really impactful publications in Nature, Science, and so on, and just a lot of, amazing academic research. What is the purpose of all this? Like, what's the point of academia? What do you see as like the main, driving force behind it, and why are you passionate about it? And
Well,
how do you see it, just from a really abstract, like high level?
no, I mean,
What do you think is the meaning of it all?
Well, yeah, the meaning of it all reminds me of this beautiful booklet that Richard Feynman wrote, "The Meaning of It All." Okay, it's a philosophical question. It's the right one. You see, I honestly think that first of all, you have to realize that research is a very personal type of endeavor. When I called it at the beginning a love affair, by that I mean it's intensely personal. That's why it's also so fragile. You know, the development is not fragile. When you do the development, let's say in a company or somewhere else, there are precise milestones. So for research is open ended, and often I've experienced that as a manager and myself. Researchers, no matter how talented they are, and often the most talented are the most insecure people. I was extremely insecure the first decade at Bell Labs because I had a very high expectation of myself. I was never happy. I wanted to do better. I saw the bright people around me and I said, I'm never going to get to that level. And so it's an intense thing. Often there is insecurity and so forth. And so the management of science, we can call it nurturing research, is extremely important because it's a personal. And I think it doesn't matter if you are developing technology and so forth. This is research either of technology or more science nature, is accept the open-endedness that is unpredictable, and it's only, the history in hindsight. And that is why it's fragile. You see, you can never predict. If you are honest and a politician or some funding agency contacts you, they said, you write these proposal. Let's face it, folks. The proposals we write at best are good fantasies. Why? Because if we are honest, we don't know what will happen when we do research. And often the highest level of research technology come as a surprise out of the blue. And that is a real value, but the impact has been enormous. I mean, once Feynman has a beautiful quote says that, the importance of the Maxwell's equations in the 19th century is so much more important than his other historical type of events like the American Revolution. So some people cringe. He was right. Look at the enormous impact of those equations. So the other thing is it's unpredictable and often only in hindsight, but because of the past, we should continue to actually support it. So, and I think it's part of our, yes, I think research is a basic instinct, right? The instinct to know, to research is a basic human instinct, and we cannot try to guide it too much or to decide a priori that this area is more important than this other, because most often the revolutionary stuff comes from areas that people never thought about, or from technology they would say it will never work. It will never work. And then it works, right?
Thanks, Federico. Yeah, if I can ask a question. So you mentioned about the good instinct is very important for the researchers. I totally agree. But how do you think for like young researchers or young professionals to get that good instinct? And also,
well, this is very, go ahead. Yes. Once I gave a talk at Harvard to students, and I gave a title, Finding Your Own Voice in Research. And I don't have a straight path. It's more like fractal, but I can tell you what has worked for me, for others. Again, it's very, you see, when we study science in books, and often the way it's actually taught, it's a sanitized way. Sanitized means, you start with Schrödinger equation, you solve problems. What misses in that story of science, and I'm not saying we should do history of science, but I'm going to get to the main point, is the process of discovery, of innovation. It's not described, whereas it be very educational when we teach to really highlight, how an idea was originated, because the creative process is a winding road. There are many wrong turns, then the right turns. So I think one thing that I learned, this I had some good people to talk to at Bell Labs. His recommendation is to try to talk to people, and more often, yes, there are senior people because of experience, and understand their modes of thinking. I was always interested when I was at Bell Labs to find out. I asked people, "How did you discover that? What is the thought process?" And it's something that when we write papers, unfortunately, disappears completely because we say it is embarrassing, it's personal. I think that's honestly wrong. Anyway, so associate yourself with good people, lot of discussion. I insist always discuss a lot. but also read. And, I read always a lot, but in the following sense. I don't recommend the balance is to find focus, because if you don't have focus, you can't accomplish anything of significance in research and in almost any area. At the same time, do not be like a horse. A horse has these things to protect the side view, otherwise they go nuts, they run around. That is where you need to have the side view. Side view means, I say, go to seminars, read the journals that are particularly good because they summarize science, like Nature and so forth, and discussion and so forth. And yeah, and it's not easy, I realize, but I still try to do that. I'm now teaching. I have been asked to teach Harvard as a new program, quantum science and engineering. They asked me to teach the course Foundation in Quantum Mechanics. And so I organized a new course, and I'm having fun. I told Xin, in fact. And I said, how am I going to teach quantum mechanics? And I said, I need to look at some of the original papers, because the way often it is presented, it says, well, you really cannot demonstrate these equation. You lay them down, then you find they describe nature. I want to understand how these great people came up with the idea. So I went back to the old first paper, The Invention of Quantum Mechanics, Heisenberg, 1925. He was 23 years old. And very difficult to read. Then I read a commentary paper, and we summarized, and I said, oh, this is amazing. So I found out the creative process, which is so original and forgotten now, how he arrived and eventually he arrives to the conclusion that the physical quantities must be matrices. So this is a beautiful example of going back to the roots, you see, to understand what was his motivation. His motivation, he wanted to get rid of quantities that you couldn't measure. Okay, that was the starting point, which was revolutionary. And then in a few steps, he arrived at this equation that is a matrix multiplication with simple math. So I said, why don't they teach this, how this great man did it, how he invented quantum mechanics? So this is a recipe, I say, try to always understand the root of things, talk to people, read laterally, and curiosity. I haven't said the word, I should have added, that's the main driving force. Maintain curiosity, relentlessly curious. I try to keep it up, and it's not easy, because when you have a large group, but you know what I'm trying to say?
Were there kind of any examples of things which led you to the big discoveries of the quantum cascade laser, which you were not thinking of, like one of those human instinct things, one of those listening to something else? Is there any kind of example you've experienced?
Oh, absolutely. I tell you, I started the research on the Casimir effect because I said, isn't it incredible that two metal plates with absolutely no charge can attract themselves? And I started reading about it. And I said, I would love to do something in this area. But then what made me think I want to do this, I said, okay, I did a simple calculation with the Casimir formula. I put two plates at 10 nanometer distance. I get 1 atmosphere of pressure. And I said, that's probably an idealized, but I can do experiments. So then I I still remember, down the hall to see David Bishop, who was heading the MEMS effort. And he said, can you make a gizmo like this, like a rotating plate? I don't want to give it. He says, yeah, let's try it. And I hired a great postdoc, Hobun Chan, who is now a professor at Hong Kong University. He fabricated this stuff, made this experiment, did it work? And then again, I was reading on the side, and I discovered the famous paper of the three Russians of 1964, which is a big mathematical paper. When I found tucked in the pages that the force could become repulsive, I had a aha moment. I said, that's what I want to do. So you know what I mean? That was something unplanned, was curiosity driven. I just Yeah, I said, isn't it incredible that two metals with no charge can attract themselves? What is this, a ghost that pushes them together? And it is the vacuum, the quantum fluctuation, right?
I can feel the excitement right now happening.
Well, I tell you something, I'm actually very excited about this because one area I haven't been able to make progress, but I think, friction is fundamental. It's fundamental also for energy. We talk about friction now as something that is almost a dull engineering thing. Well, friction is fundamentally quantum mechanical. So I believe that a quantum mechanical deep understanding of friction is essential to optimize. If you have too much friction, things don't work. But if you have zero friction, things can't move, right? So there is an optimum friction. So that may be tied to some deep and quantum mechanical understanding of things like van der Waals forces, and it's another very exciting area is to understand turbulence, the famous cascade of turbulence that Landau worked on it, Heisenberg, even Fermi. And, it's still not understood there. These vortices become smaller and smaller. So I've been thinking, can we use, in fact, our diffractive optics, maybe singular optics, to study turbulence at very small scales? And I think these are valid questions driven by curiosity. I wish I could do better now, but I'm starting to think.
Federico, also expanding in the area of this curiosity-driven, exciting experiments. So, what if money or human resources was not a restriction, and you could build any physical experiment today on Earth or in space? What would it be?
Well, this is something I've been discussing. When I came to, there is a lot of. Well, I have a number of dreams technologically. If one could make a source, an optical source, like a semiconductor source that is electrically driven, that can give on-demand photons in streams of single photon or entangled states at room temperature, could be revolutionary. There is nothing that says that it can't be done. The temperature is not a major obstacle. It is not fundamental. So that's one area. Another one, there's a lot of search of dark matter. Now, that's one of the most incredible things that the majority of stuff around, we don't know what it is. And most of the dark matter searches have been down in the mines in Utah, whatever. So I wonder if there is a possibility to do some tabletop searches of, dark matter or these stuff. Again, I do not see a showstopper there in this area. And then there is always the question about quantum information. We are talking now of a second quantum revolution. Quantum mechanics will become pervasive in technology in ways that we can even not dream about now. I would like to do something in this area, but again, it's as I say, it's not the area that is really interesting. It's to formulate the problem to solve. It doesn't matter whether it's basic applied technology science, and the formulation of the problem, which is the right question. So I constantly struggle with this, and that's why what drives me. I try to read a lot, to listen, and eventually it's a continuous struggle. The moment I will stop struggling, my brain will stop working.
Orat, go ahead and ask your question.
Hey, Federico. It's nice to hear from you. Always a pleasure to hear you talk about this kind of stuff. You've a little bit alluded to what your answer to this question would be, but I want to put a point on it. I want to hear exactly what you think. So, as you know, I recently published my paper on a space plate about a year and a half ago now.
Yeah, and you gave a beautiful talk, and
thank
you
you.
complimented my group for asking you very good questions, right?
So this paper, like when we were developing this work, I remember thinking this is the greatest thing I've ever done. I remember thinking this is absolutely amazing. It's gonna change everything. I remember thinking this. And then a month after we put our paper up on arXiv, another group, this is Chan Wei-Fan at Stanford, put up basically a very similar paper where they also developed the space plate, which means they were working on it at the same time. So to me, I mean, I felt good that I was first, but that's not the point. The point is, if I wasn't around, it would still have been developed. If I wasn't working on this problem, someone else would have solved it kind of around the same time, basically. And it kind of makes me feel like, I mean, this is me working on something that to me was like a trailblazing thing. This is something no one else is working on. You know, it's not like we're enhancing the bandwidth of something or increasing the queue of something. Like, this is a completely new platform, and yet someone else also was going there. So this is kind of like hinting to what Mikhail said. So what's the point of me working on it then? I mean, even the stuff that I think is my best work ever, is being worked on by someone else anyway. So if I wasn't around, it wouldn't.
Well, but let me say something. This touches on a point that a good question again, and it's a slightly different angle. Or Mika, it is the following. It's been my own experience in this. Like, if you really have, it's more likely if you have a really hot idea new that there are other smart people as you, possibly more. It happened to me several times that are on a very close to doing this thing. It happened to me, in fact, in the quantum cascade laser. There was another group hot in pursuit of the so-called interband cascade laser, but was related to it. They did a year later, and I was, when the paper came out, I was shocked, as I said. I thought I was really the only one.
Yeah, exactly.
But at some point it's kind of a bit, I heard this has happened. The real important discoveries of environmentals quite often happen almost simultaneously in several places. And the reason is ultimately top research is driven. It's a bit like Pareto's work for economy, that roughly says in a simplistic way, 90% of the important work is done by 10% of the people. That is also true for research. I would say the really important work post revolution is done by a small percentage. And in the small percentage, there are very bright people. They have the right instinct and trying things. I mean, there are many examples in history. Look, in math, the so-called geometry, the non-Euclidean geometry, right, that then was used for general activity, came up simultaneously by Riemann in Germany, by Lobachevsky in Russia, and by third, more or less exactly at the same time. I mean, the same happened with the relativity. It was Poincaré, Lorentz, and Einstein. In fact, Poincaré gave a first lecture on special relativity before the Einstein paper. Okay, and there are so many. Quantum mechanics was also like this. It happened. There was a group. So it's sort of it points to something very interesting. It's related to the fact that it's a kind of an extreme activity research. It drives some of the very best people that are competitive, want to do the best. And so if you think, I tell you, if you have a hot idea, you better pursue it hard, because I bet that there are a few smart people out there that are ready, that are in pole position to use a car racing thing. If you are working on something so and so, well, it is likely that there are many other people, not so many other people that are working on your so and so new idea. They'll be working on some other so and so. So I think top ideas tend to be like attractor points in actual knowledge that attract a few people that then often come there are so many examples. I mean, I must know 20, 30 examples like this of big stuff that occur almost simultaneously.
I guess two responses. So first, thank you for comparing my spaceplate work to general relativity. That's pretty cool. But on a more serious note, doesn't that sort of suggest that a lot of these discoveries are inevitable and that any individual researcher isn't particularly unique? It's kind of just an ensemble thing. where
Yeah,
no matter what.
yes, so, but I ultimately, let me think about it. Some stuff is inevitable. Let me put one thing, for example. I'm going to say something that many people will disagree with me. Technology is far less predictable than science. Why? Because technology is affected also by much more than science, by sociological, by economic constraints, far more than actual science. And it is true. So it's very hard to predict what is the next. Now we said that the PC was obvious. The PC was not obvious at all. In fact, that's why Xerox, who invented the PC technology, sold it for nothing to Apple, right? To actually Steve Jobs. There are a ton of examples like this. Kodak invented digital photography. They didn't see the potential impact because, again, there are so many factors. So there is a fundamental lack of predictability. After the fact, it's easy to say. So, and ultimately, I think we should be driven by our passion, curiosity, and I am a big believer in actually science. It is a basic instinct. We all know what the basic instincts are, right? It's a basic thing. There is no point in stopping knowledge or creating or saying, we shouldn't be working in this area. When CRISPR technology came out, I read the beautiful book on CRISPR, which I recommend by Jennifer Doudna, and she obviously was very debating how much we should push. But at the end, it is unstoppable, right? It's thirst for knowledge is a basic instinct, right?
Yeah, right.
So
Yeah,
we
you're
should,
right.
we
I
should,
mean,
so we
in
should
terms of my
encourage.
selfish desires, right? Of course, it's fun for me to keep working on this.
Yeah. But look,
But
fun. You see, I honestly, this is something I said once at a talk, not like this, and I raised eyebrows, and I said, we should pursue primarily science and technology for fun. That is the main motivation because I like it. And then someone said, that's egotistic, self centered. You are a mature scientist. I said, it's absolutely crucial. You have to believe in yourself. It's a bit like an art. A top artist, it's a creative process. You have to believe in yourself and that it will have some impact. Maybe in the next life, you're going to have, you don't know if you're going to be born again as an elephant, as a pig, or whatever, or maybe not born again, right? But I think that we have to recognize this. Again, I insist, it's like a basic instinct and we should cater to it, not try to limit it. You know what I mean?
Hi,
yeah,
Federico. This is Michael Saliba speaking. I had given a talk in your group actually a few years back on perovskite solar cells.
Oh,
And
yes, I remember.
I have now my own position and group in Germany at the University of Stuttgart.
Yeah.
And I always find it very interesting how, the body of knowledge, or at least of papers, it's not necessarily the same thing, doubles in such a short time frame. And I guess, how do you sort of like find sort of a winning topic in contrast to a hype? If you look at artificial intelligence at the moment, it seems you have to put it in all the proposals and all the papers. But how do
Well,
you, as an individual, sort of stop of just following a hype?
no, there are signs of, I work in a field right now that has a lot of hype, metamaterials, metasurface hype. I happen to think that what we are doing is not hype at all. And I predict safely it will have a large impact in technology. We have chosen carefully these directions here. But how to recognize hype? Well, it's a bit experience. When I hear talks, there are certain indicators about when statesmen tend to be too, you can feel the exaggeration is one of the smoking guns, right? And then there is also another aspect. Let me see how I actually can say it. It's see the real work. Well, look, I'll give you one example. One problem: there are too many papers we know, and I've spoken, against the high impact factor. This metric, measuring people by impact factor, is nonsense. Nonsense, complete nonsense. Look, I have a high impact factor. I know it. It's 150. I could care less. Honestly, it's never on my mind. People tell me, Federico, how did you do it? I don't know. It's not a valid metric. Okay. And in fact, Mr. Hirsch, who created it, and I met him once at a meeting where I was openly criticizing in a social thing, having cocktails, so that helped. He was nodding and said, you know, Federico, yes, this became highly cited, but sometime I wish I had not published that paper because it has been misused by institutions to rank people and it drives the opposite behavior in. So we have to be very careful about not putting any, to avoid this kind of metrics. So ultimately, you know, do we like to publish in these journals? Absolutely. I am one of them. But I'm very careful in saying, you know, look, the journal doesn't have to be the top driver. Whereas I see people obsessed because they ask me, sometimes they email me, says, Federico, tell us, how did you get this paper published in Science? I say, there is a recipe, yes. We need to, and my group knows it. I've always been obsessed, even at Bell Labs. We have a duty as scientists to write clearly and simply, clearly and simply. And that is a hard job. That is a hard job. I learned it at University of Rome. Three of my professors worked with Enrico Fermi, who was legendary physicist, also for his extraordinary clarity and simplicity of actual writing. And so they said, you know, he could not tolerate obscure, pretentious language. The problem is, you know, I am trying to educate myself now in topological photonics. Why are these papers? They seem to want to showing off the mathematical prowess. So I think it's very important also for scientific success, ultimate, to learn how to write in the clearest, simplest, and most direct way. I will give you one example. You know, when I studied the University of Rome quantum electron dynamics, I took Heitler, which was it's still the fundamental books, and I had a very hard time. Then one of my professors who had worked with Fermi, Edoardo Maldi, he did the famous experiment on transmutation, you know, Newton radioactivity. He said, no, read his paper, Review of Modern Physics. It was written in 1932. You will like it. It's so simple. I read it. I said, now I understand QED. You know what I mean? So we have a duty to be clear and simple when we write.
That's just reminds me of the paper on the discovery of DNA. It's my favorite paper. It's like 2 pages
Yes.
that Francis and Crick submitted to Nature.
And then at the end, there is the famous understatement. It
Yes.
did not escape our attention, right, that this structure leads immediately to see the replication process, right? Amazing. In 2 lines, they suggested the mechanism.
Yes, exactly. I was like, I mean, that's like the best concise paper maybe ever. So just kind of wrapping up, we had one question that I think it's interesting that this format, like the Twitter Spaces format, is pretty unique. And I think it's been great speaking with you in this kind of open fireside chat type format where also like the audience can ask questions and so on. Who would you, if you had to choose one person to actually, for you to attend a Twitter Spaces where another person is you know, the invited guest, who would you choose? If you had to select anybody in the world.
Oh, yes, I would choose right now. There are some great people that I could choose. And there is, for example, you could get Michael Berry. Michael Berry is one of my favorite, yes, I could say, intellectual partners. I've often exchanged emails with him. You know, he's the guy of the Berry phase and so forth. Okay, but you could also get people. Of course, you had the person about the gravitational waves. You know, I think you could definitely get. Well, you know, I would get, if you could get them, either Charpentier or Jennifer Doudna to talk about CRISPR. They are still in their prime scientifically. They got their Nobel Prize sufficiently early that they're going to be able to still do great work. So I would invite Jennifer Doudna this. Okay. The other possibility is Donna Strickland, okay, who got the Nobel Prize with Gerard Mourou. Okay, and that would be a very a good one. Another one, and she's a really great scientist. She just won the Wolf Prize for the work in attosecond science and technology. They won it in three. One is Paul Korkum. The other one is Ferenc Krauss at the Max Planck. And the third one is a French scientist. Her name is Huillier, Huillier. And I think particularly she could be, I think, a very good communicator. But I would choose first probably either Charpentier or Jennifer Doudna wrote an amazingly good book. I know nothing about biologists. And if I understand at some level CRISPR, I owe it to having read that book on by her.
That's a great suggestion and also an excellent challenge for us. So you should prepare your questions for Doudna and Charpentier. We'll try to get them together. That would be very interesting.
Look, it is going to be fun. I mean, I wish I could live another 100 years, but what can happen now at the interface between you understand that the future frontier will be quantum biology. I thought that this is nonsense, but when they discovered that migratory birds, there was a major paper, now orient themselves quantum mechanically with a tiny magnet, so this is at the atomic level, right, in their brains, I believe. This is amazing. I mean, the quantum, we will find in the next 20 years that quantum is pervasive in biology also.
Yes, very fascinating. And there's a book by Khalili, Life on the Edge, that goes into that. So yeah, I fully agree with you. So
what's the name? What's the name of this book?
Life on the Edge. I can send it to you later, like the title. Yeah, it's a great read, but I think you already know most of the stories that it is treating. So it is the time to wrap up our event. Let's all thank Professor Capasso for the exciting and very, very interesting conversation. I feel like we've all learned a lot, and in particular, like things that we usually cannot Google. Also, thank you to the audience for your participation, and stay tuned for the upcoming events when we look at the stories behind great discoveries in physics and maybe biology next time. Thank you, everyone.
Very good. Bye. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for organizing.
Thank you so much.